She sits in a Summit County courtroom smiling, convinced the jury will believe her. Her defense is simple. She was too mentally ill to know what she was doing, that when the moment came, her mind had fractured so completely she couldn't tell right from wrong. Her lawyers would argue she was sick, not guilty, and for a while it seemed to be working. Then the prosecution stepped in, with witnesses, with autopsy reports, and with a phone call that unraveled everything her defense had built. This is the case of Sydney Powell, a university freshman who killed her mother inside their family home in Akron, Ohio, then picked up the phone and calmly pretended to be her. Every detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, trial testimony, body camera footage, and official court proceedings in Summit County, Ohio. Prepare yourself, because what happened inside that house on March 3, 2020, did not begin that morning. The machinery that led to it had been running for more than a year, hidden behind a performance so convincing that even the people closest to her never saw it coming. Brenda Powell was 50 years old and lived in Akron, Ohio, a working-class city in Summit County. She had spent nearly 3 decades building a career at Akron Children's Hospital, where she worked as a child life specialist in the hematology-oncology unit, dedicated to helping seriously ill children and their families cope with the emotional toll of a hospital stay. She founded the hospital's teen oncology program. She showed up for children in the worst moments of their lives, professionally and personally. People who knew the Powell family said Brenda was more than just Sydney's mother. She was her best friend. That bond, the closeness between them, the trust, is not a small detail in this story. It is the center of it. Sydney Powell was a bright student. She attended St. Vincent St. Mary High School in Akron, where she played soccer and lacrosse and maintained a high GPA. She was the kind of student who earned her way into college on academic merit, winning a presidential scholarship that helped cover tuition and relieved financial pressure on her parents. In the fall of 2018, Sydney enrolled at the University of Mount Union in Alliance, Ohio, about an hour from home. Her best friend from high school, Lauren Curry, enrolled with her, and they lived together on campus. Lauren testified at trial that Sydney was social, charismatic, and bubbly, a girl who showed no signs of anything being wrong. What Sydney's family did not know was that her time at Mount Union had not gone the way anyone hoped. Her grades had seriously slipped. She failed 3 out of 4 classes. After her first year, she was placed on academic probation. When the university ran the numbers in the fall semester of 2019, it was clear Sydney could no longer remain enrolled. She was suspended for poor academic performance. She told no one. Her parents never received any communication from the university about the suspension. Once a student turns 18, schools treat them as adults, regardless of who is paying the tuition. Sydney understood that. She used it. She stayed in her dorm room. She left at the times she would have left for class. She attended sorority events. When friends noticed her name tag had disappeared from outside her door, she told them there had been some confusion with the university. She showed up on campus even after she had no reason to be there. She found ways to get through locked building doors. She attended classes she was no longer registered for. When a close friend noticed inconsistencies in her stories and confronted her, Sydney told her she was fine. Lauren testified at trial about what she observed during that time. "I think she struggled in her classes. I don't think her grades were the best, but she didn't really tell me that. But I think you could tell, especially at the end, that she just wasn't doing her best, not like in high school." This went on for months. A complete parallel existence maintained every day in front of people who knew her well. Then, a week before March 3, 2020, the university discovered she had been lying. They told Sydney she had to leave her dorm. With nowhere to go and no one she was willing to tell, she started paying cash for hotel rooms, burning through whatever money she had left. Her parents could track her location through the Life 360 family app, but the app couldn't tell them what was actually happening. Brenda had almost figured it out. On February 25th, just 6 days before she died, she sent Sydney a text message. "Why do I always feel like you're scamming me? Just remember, you need to keep the grades to keep your scholarship." Sydney wrote back, "My grades are good, thank you very much." Keep that text message in mind. It would later become a vital piece of evidence. On the morning of March 3, 2020, Steve Powell was at work at a steel treating company in Akron. He tried to pay Sydney's tuition, but the payment was declined, and he had been logged out of the parent portal. He called the university to find out what was going on and was told Sydney was no longer enrolled. He opened the Life 360 app and saw that her location was not at school, it was at their home in Akron. He drove home immediately. Sydney was there. She already had her story ready. She told Steve there had been a mix-up with the university, that she was still attending some classes with her friend Lauren, still submitting papers to her lecturers. Steve had no reason to doubt her, but he felt the situation would be better handled by Brenda. He called his wife, explained what he had found, and left for work. What Steve did not know was that the call would change their lives forever. Brenda was on her way home. She called the university herself, leaving messages for Associate Dean Michelle Gaffin and Dean of Students John Fraser, trying to understand what was happening with Sydney. When she arrived, Sydney was there. Brenda tried to calm things down, told Sydney everything would be okay. At 12:36 p.m., Dean Fraser called Brenda back. Associate Dean Gaffin was on the line too. Dean Fraser had barely introduced himself when they heard it. A loud, heavy thud, then another, and another. 6 times total. Then silence. Associate Dean Gaffin testified about what she heard on that call.
There was a very large, or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream. And the scream might have actually been first, and then the thud.
Okay.
As I think about it, and then there was sort of an expulsion. The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Okay.
I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like.
While Brenda was still on the call with Dean Fraser, Sydney had walked into the kitchen. She came back with a cast iron skillet and swung it at her mother's head. Then she grabbed a knife and stabbed her over and over, from the waist up. Brenda fought back. The medical examiner would later document at least 32 stab wounds and multiple blunt force blows to the neck. What Sydney did not know was that Dean Fraser and Associate Dean Gaffin were still on the line. They had heard everything. Confused and alarmed, they called back. Once, twice, no answer. On the third attempt, someone picked up, but it wasn't Brenda. It was Sydney, attempting to pretend she was her mother. Dean Fraser asked, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" The voice on the line said, "Yes, this is Brenda." Gaffin testified, "Both Dean Fraser and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads and said, 'That's not Brenda.' And he said, 'Sydney, I think this is you. This is not Brenda.'" The phone went dead. Gaffin and Fraser contacted law enforcement and requested a welfare check at the Powell home. The dispatch call went through to Officer Kenneth Dyes, who happened to be Steve Powell's friend. He recognized the address immediately and called Steve to let him know there was an emergency at his house. Steve called Sydney to warn her that police were on the way. Officers arrived at the Powell home and found Sydney in a visibly unstable state outside the house. Body camera footage captured the scene, officers breaking through to get inside, Sydney screaming, the chaos of first responders trying to process what they were walking into.
She's on the ground.
Who is it?
My mom! Someone broke in the back window.
All right, hold on.
She's on the ground.
Hold on. Where's your mom? Okay, stay right here.
No, there's so much blood. No, please!
Man!
She's in the court now! No!
Stop! Hold on, we gotta figure out what's going on.
1300.
Can you sit down? Can you sit down?
Oh, nice. Get that 32 roll real quick. We got a female down.
Take her outside.
Inside, they found Brenda in a pool of blood. A cast iron skillet and a knife lay nearby. She was still alive, but in serious condition. She was rushed to the hospital.
Come on. Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on.
I
Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
want my dad.
Huh?
I want my dad.
What happened? What's going on? What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. So I came back and she was on the ground.
Okay, you heard a
I ran
bang.
out back. There was a bang. Someone broke in.
What is your name?
Sydney.
Are you cut?
I don't think so.
Yeah, you're cut somewhere.
I don't think so.
Yeah, your hand.
No, I was helping her. I grabbed her.
All right, stop.
I tell you what, can you sit on the ground here real quick?
Unit dispatch.
Come on. Come on.
You said the ground.
Yeah, you're fine right there.
No.
You're fine right there.
Make a call, please.
Steve arrived at the house to find police officers everywhere. Body camera footage captured the moment he tried to understand what was happening, the confusion, the fear, the desperate questions.
What's going on?
I don't know. We just got
the dad. I'm the dad.
Okay,
Sydney.
what's-
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Daddy.
What? What the hell? Where's my wife?
The window's broken, Dad.
Where?
The back window's broken in.
So you're gonna have to.
Daddy.
There's officers inside there, so
You okay?
I don't know. She was there.
go
Was so
check
much
the lady in the
blood.
house, okay? She's got minor cuts.
Officers told him Brenda was alive and had been taken to the hospital. Steve went to the police station to give investigators his account of the day.
I said, well, let me call. So I called Brenda, and it rings on her cell phone, no answer. I call Sydney back, it rings, no answer. I call Brenda back, ring, no answer. I'm pacing around. I call Jeep back, and as I'm on the phone with him, telling him there's no answer, my doctor calls me back and said, oh, Mom's on the phone with Mount Union. I said, well, cops are on the way. And she went, there's been a break-in, and she just started going off. She said, what? She said, there's been somebody broke into the house. There's blood everywhere.
While he was there, still speaking to officers, he received the news. Really bad news. Your wife passed away.
Really bad news. Your wife passed away.
The look on Steve's face was something words cannot capture. The physical evidence inside the house did not match Sydney's story. Bloody footprints led directly to her. The open window and the door left ajar, staged to suggest a break-in, had both been opened from the inside. There was no forced entry, no sign of an intruder, no evidence of a third party anywhere in the home. Just the remnants of a close-range attack on a woman who never had the chance to call for help. 24 hours after Brenda's death, Sydney was arrested and charged with murder. Her body still carried marks from the struggle. Detectives had more than enough to establish that the cast iron skillet and the knife had been used by Sydney, not an unknown intruder. Steve's warning call before police arrived had given her time to attempt a staged break-in, but the staging was not enough. After her arrest, Sydney was placed in a psychiatric facility. While there, doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia. She was stabilized on antipsychotic medications, treated, and eventually deemed competent to stand trial. Her father, Steve, who had testified that Sydney had never shown violence before in her life, that the mother-daughter bond had been unbreakable, and that he believed his daughter was sick, asked prosecutors not to take the case to trial. So did Brenda's own mother. The family did not want a prosecution. The law enforcement and prosecution moved forward regardless. Due to COVID-related court delays, the trial did not begin until September 7, 2023, more than 3 years after the killing. It was held in Summit County Court of Common Pleas before Judge Kelly McLaughlin. Sydney was 23 now, being tried for a crime that happened when she was 19. The prosecution laid out its position in opening arguments.
This is not a case about who did it. This is not a case about how it was done. This case will come down to this sole question: whether or not Ms. Powell, at the time of the murder, was suffering from a severe mental disease which prevented her from knowing the wrongfulness of those actions. And although that sounds like a direct question, I want to stress to each of you, it's not as simple as reading a medical report. It's not as simple as listening to testimony from doctors. You are going to have to listen to all the evidence. You're going to have to weigh that evidence. And the state believes that when you hear that evidence, apply it to your role as a juror, you're going to be able to recognize that Miss Sydney Powell is responsible for the murder of her mother, Brenda, and she was not suffering from a severe mental illness or disease that prevented her from knowing the wrongfulness of what she did.
The defense gave its own opening statement.
I think what you're going to experience is this. I think about 90% of the state's case, their evidence and their witnesses is going to be focused on what happened. What happened on March 3rd, 2020, inside the Scudder home of the Powells. And I think you're also going to see that 90% of the defense case is going to be focused on what Mr. McAleese, I think, has correctly identified as the sole core question in this case, and that is why? Why? Why did this happen? What happened is not in dispute. Sydney Powell caused the injuries that led to her mother's death. Why is the question?
Steve Powell took the stand. He testified about the parent portal, about being told Sydney was no longer enrolled, about driving home and finding her there.
The only thing that I knew is when I tried to sign on to the, like their whatever app that they have on the website, it kept kicking me out.
The app that Mount Union had?
Yeah, they're like a portal, I think it's called.
A portal? Okay, and you would try to sign into that portal and it wouldn't let you in?
Correct.
He described how she had explained it all away, told him it was a mix-up, that she was still going to some classes with Lauren, that she was still submitting papers.
When you had difficulty logging onto that portal, what did you do?
I asked Sydney what was going on about it.
Okay, and what did she say?
There was a mistake with Mount Union.
Okay.
And she'd look into it.
Okay, and at that point you had no reason not to trust
Correct.
what she's telling you?
Correct.
And to be fair, you always found her trustworthy.
Yes.
Fair to say?
Fair.
He had believed her. He had always found her trustworthy. He told her they would work through it together, that she could take the summer off if she needed to. He described the call he made to Brenda, asking her to come home, telling her she was better at handling these things than he was. When asked if he stayed until Brenda arrived, Steve paused. I left before she got there. He had gone back to work, knowing Brenda was on her way home, knowing Sydney was there, not knowing what was about to happen.
Did you stay at home until Brenda got there, or did you leave before she got home?
I left before she got there.
So you went back to work knowing that Brenda was on her way home?
Yes.
Associate Dean Gaffin took the stand and walked the jury through the phone call in detail. The thuds, the screaming, the silence, and then the moment Sydney picked up and said in a calm, steady voice, "Yes, this is Brenda."
And what did you tell Brenda at that time?
So Dean Fraser was speaking and simply said, Brenda, this is Dean Fraser. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our associate dean of students. We're returning your call, and that's about as far as we got.
Did Brenda respond to that introduction at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
What did she say?
I think he asked, "Is this Brenda Powell?"
Oh, okay.
And she said yes, and then he identified himself.
Okay. And Miss Gaffney, what happened next?
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream, and the scream might have actually been first, and then the thud.
Okay.
As I think about it, and then there was sort of an expulsion. The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Okay.
I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like. And then several more repeated thuds. I don't know how to describe the sound.
No, and that's okay. And you and Mr. Fraser could hear this from the other end of the phone.
It was on speakerphone, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear any communication during these thuds?
Just the screaming. And so we decided to while we were waiting for the address, to keep calling. We called the number back.
Brenda's number?
Brenda's number that she had left. And we called twice, and there was no answer. It rang and rang and rang, and no answer. When it went to voicemail, we hung up and we called again. And then on the third time, and I had just gotten the address as the phone was answered.
Okay.
On the third try to the number, and Dean Fraser said something along the lines of, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" And the voice on the other end said, "Yes, this is Brenda." Yes, this is Brenda.
Now, Ms. Gaffney, did you recognize that voice on the line?
Yeah.
Okay, was that Brenda
It
Powell?
was not Brenda.
Who did you recognize that voice to be?
I was sure it was Sydney. Both Dean Fraser and I looked at each other and sort of shook our heads at each other and said, that's not Brenda.
The central battle of the trial was fought between expert witnesses. The defense called three: Dr. James Rearon, Dr. Robin Belchur-Tim, and Dr. Scott Swale, each of whom had evaluated Sydney independently. Together, according to the defense, they had spent 30 hours with her and administered 25 separate diagnostic tests. Each reached the same conclusion, that on March 3, 2020, Sydney Powell was in an acute psychotic state suffering from schizoaffective disorder and was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of what she was doing. Dr. Rearon testified that Sydney had been deteriorating for months before the killing.
What is your occupation? What do you do?
I'm a psychologist.
How long have you been a psychologist?
I've been licensed since 1976. I've been in practice as a licensed psychologist since 1977. In Sydney's case, it's my opinion that her conditions were likely a combination of biological and situational. And the onset, like I said, probably we have evidence of precursors back to probably several years before the events of 3/3/20.
So what were those precursors? Can you tell the jury, what do you recall identifying as some potential precursors or symptoms of schizophrenia well before March 3rd of 2020?
Some of the interviews that I did, like with several of her friends or with her English teacher, Catherine Milligan, indicated that she had not frequently, but at times pretty significantly demonstrated precursors like panic attack, panic symptoms, at times withdrawal. But again, when she was in high school, if you are looking at her and looking at the situation on the outside, everything looks like it's fine. She's an honor student. She's a scholar athlete. She's, not getting into a lot of trouble. There's no behavioral issues. She's got a good relationship with friends. She's got a good relationship with family and parents. But some of her friends and the teacher, Catherine Milligan, reported episodes where she would overreact to a situation, have a panic attack in relation to a chemistry presentation that she, ultimately nailed.
He argued that her lies to her parents were not calculated deception, but an alternate reality she had constructed because her academic failure was psychologically impossible for her to accept. He testified that she was living in a state where the falsehood felt more real to her than the facts. He also pointed to the closeness of Sydney and Brenda's relationship as evidence, arguing it was impossible for Sydney to have killed her mother in a lucid state of mind, given how deeply bonded they were. Dr. Swale diagnosed her with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and said she experienced active schizophrenic symptoms until May 2020, followed by 4 months of suicidal ideation. He administered tests specifically designed to rule out malingering, the faking of symptoms, and concluded she was not faking. Dr. Belchur-Tim described Sydney's case as atypical because the typical risk factors for violence, a history of aggression, extreme childhood trauma, substance abuse, were entirely absent. She had none of them. The prosecution called one expert witness, Dr. Sylvia Oradovich. She met with Sydney Powell for 2 hours and concluded that Sydney was not legally insane at the time of the murder. In her opinion, Sydney showed borderline personality traits and an unspecified anxiety disorder, but did not meet the legal threshold for severe mental illness that would render her legally insane. She described Sydney during evaluation as less than honest and forthcoming. Then, Dr. Oradovich went further, directly challenging the methods used by the defense experts, calling their approach fundamentally flawed. She argued that their tests relied heavily on self-reporting and were therefore unreliable for assessing sanity years after the crime. She said the most reliable evidence comes from what a person said and did at the time of the incident, not evaluations conducted long after the fact. Here is what mattered critically about that testimony. None of those methodological attacks appeared in Dr. Oradovich's written report. The defense had received that report ahead of trial and built their entire case around what was inside it. The attacks on the defense experts' methods were introduced for the first time on the witness stand, leaving the defense with no opportunity to prepare a response. Defense attorney Don Malarick immediately asked the judge to allow him to recall one of the expert witnesses to rebut Dr. Oradovich's testimony. His motion was denied. Both sides rested. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. On September 20th, 2023, the verdict came in.
Verdict form number 1 as to count 1 reads, "We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled, sworn, and affirmed, do hereby find the defendant Sydney Powell guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 1.
Judge McLaughlin sentenced Sydney Powell to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in the Ohio Department of Corrections on the murder count, plus 3 years on a separate count to run concurrently. What had stayed with the jury through all 9 hours of deliberation was the phone call. The moment Sydney picked up the line in the minutes after killing her mother and said in a calm, steady voice, "Yes, this is Brenda." The prosecution had argued it was the most powerful piece of evidence not because it proved planning, but because it proved awareness. A person in an acute psychotic break, unable to distinguish right from wrong, does not pick up a phone and attempt to impersonate the person they just killed. That moment, that calculated, composed response, was the prosecution's answer to everything the defense had built. Sydney's defense attorney spoke to the media after sentencing. His words reflected the weight of what the trial had been for everyone involved. "It's been tough. Sydney reminds me a lot of my daughter. Throughout this trial, I've tried to ask, what would Brenda do? And what came back to me was, make sure that Sydney knows I love her." Sydney's legal team immediately appealed the conviction. The appeal rested on one argument. When the state's expert challenged the defense's psychiatric evidence on the stand using methods not disclosed in her written report, the defense had an absolute right to call a rebuttal witness. Denying that motion, they argued, violated Sydney's right to a fair trial. In December 2024, the 9th District Court of Appeals sided with Sydney. The 3-judge panel ruled the trial court had made a reversible error. Once the state brought its own expert to attack the insanity defense, Sydney had to be allowed to respond. The conviction was overturned. The Summit County Prosecutor's Office did not accept it quietly. In February 2025, they appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court. Their argument was direct. The appellate ruling broke more than a century of legal precedent and could rewrite how trials are conducted across the entire state of Ohio. No criminal defendant, they argued, has an unconditional right to present additional evidence. The appeals court got the law wrong. As of now, the Ohio Supreme Court has accepted the case and heard oral arguments. Sydney Powell is serving her 15 years to life sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. The court has not yet issued its ruling. Brenda Powell, the woman who spent nearly 3 decades helping seriously ill children and their families through the worst moments of their lives, who founded a teen oncology program, who was described by everyone who knew her as more than a mother, as a best friend, never got the chance to know what her daughter had been hiding. She walked through her own front door that afternoon to have a conversation. She never walked back out.